The salt from the ramen steam didn't sting Ilyas's eyes nearly as much as the silence did. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that filled their cramped apartment, settling into the cracks of the peeling wallpaper like a mold that refused to be scrubbed away. Across the chipped formica table, 7-year-old Maya was meticulously separating the peas from her noodles. The rhythmic clinking clink of a plastic fork was the only heartbeat the room had left. Elias forced a grin, a jagged, rusted thing that didn't reach his tired eyes, and pushed the bowl with the extra egg toward her. "I ate at the sight, bug," he lied. The words felt like gravel in his throat. As if on cue, his stomach let out a hollow, cavernous growl that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He quickly covered the sound with a staged, barking cough, the kind of noise a man makes when he's trying to drown out the sound of his own desperation. He was 34 years old, but in the harsh, flickering overhead fluorescent light, he looked like a man who had lived twice that and regretted most of it. His hands were the map of his life, calloused, scarred, and stained with the permanent, deep-seated grease of a diesel mechanic that no amount of orange-scented industrial soap could ever fully lift. Tonight, those hands were trembling. He tucked them under the table, gripping his knees until his knuckles turned white. The fine started 2 years ago, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and sterile hospital corridors. When the light went out of Sarah's eyes, Elias had made a silent, frantic vow to the empty air of the ICU. "Maya will never feel the cold." To keep that promise, Elias had become an architect of illusions. He built a fortress of fine around their lives. "How's your back, Dad?" Maya would ask, watching him wince as he stood up from the couch. "Fine, bug. Just a little stiff from winning the championship in my head. Are we okay for rent, Dad?" The landlord left a red paper on the door. "Fine, Maya. That's just a colorful receipt. Don't you worry about red papers." But the fine was a crumbling bridge, and Elias was standing in the center as the cables snapped one by one. The medical debt from Sarah's battle with stage 4 lymphoma hadn't died with her. It had followed him home like a vengeful ghost, manifesting in thick envelopes and polite but firm phone calls that eventually turned into snarling threats. He had sold his truck, first the 1998 Silverado he'd spent his 20s rebuilding. Then went his father's gold watch. Lately he was selling his very biology. He was a ghost in his own home, a fleeting shadow Maya saw between his double shifts. He'd worked 10 hours at the garage smelling of gasoline and defeat, and then transitioned straight into a graveyard security gig at a cold storage warehouse on the edge of the city. The warehouse was a tomb of concrete and steel where the temperature stayed at a constant, biting 30 degrees. Elias would pace the perimeter, his breath hitching in the frozen air, his mind tallying numbers that never quite added up. Rent, $1,200. Utilities, $180. Maya's school supplies, $40. Total remaining, $212. He would stare at the security monitors, his eyes burning, and think about the $212. It was a small number to the world, but to him, it was a mountain. It was the difference between a hot meal and a cold one. It was the price of his daughter's peace. One evening 3 weeks before the parent-teacher conference that would change everything, Elias found Maya sitting on the floor of the living room surrounded by her art supplies. The apartment was freezing. The radiator had been clanking and hissing for days without producing a lick of heat. Elias was wearing his heavy work jacket inside, but Maya was wrapped in Sarah's old oversized cardigan, her small fingers poking out from the wool sleeves. "What's your drawing, bug?" he asked, dropping his toolkit by the door with a heavy thud. Every bone in his body felt like it had been replaced with lead. "Nothing," she said quickly, flipping the sketchbook over. Elias felt a tiny sharp prick of anxiety. Maya didn't hide things. She was a creature of light and transparency. "Hey, come on, is it a dragon? A spaceship? A spaceship dragon?" Maya looked up at him. Her eyes were her mother's, large, soulful, and far too perceptive for a child who still believed in the tooth fairy. "It was just a person, Daddy, but I didn't get the colors right. We'll get you new crayons on Saturday," Elias promised, his heart sinking because he knew he didn't have the $5 to spare. "It's okay," she whispered, looking back at the floor. "I don't need colors for this one anyway." He knelt beside her, his knees popping like a string of firecrackers. He wanted to pull her into his lap, to tell her that the heat would be back on soon, that he wasn't tired, that the world was a kind and gentle place. But the lie died in his throat. Instead, he just reached out and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "You're the best thing I ever made, Maya. You know that." She didn't smile. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. "You didn't make me, Daddy. You're just holding me up." The exhaustion was a physical entity now. It sat on his chest when he tried to breathe. It blurred the edges of his vision. At the garage, his boss, Miller, a man with a heart like a rusted muffler, had started noticing. "Elias, you're dragging." Miller said, tossing a grease-stained rag onto the workbench. You put the wrong oil in the Mercury. If I have to pay for a new engine because your head's in the clouds, you're done. I don't care how long you've been here. Elias looked at Miller, and for a second he saw the man through a haze of red. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell him about the nights spent in the freezing warehouse, about the $212, about the way Maya looked in that oversized cardigan. But he just lowered his head. It won't happen again, Miller. I'm fine. Yeah, Miller grunted, walking away. Everyone's fine until they're not. That night, Elias didn't go to the warehouse. He couldn't. His body simply refused to move. He sat in his parked car in the driveway of the apartment complex, the engine off, the cold seeping through the floorboards. He sat there for an hour, staring at the lit window of their second-story unit. He could see Maya's silhouette through the thin curtains. She was moving back and forth, probably cleaning up the kitchen or organizing her school bag. She was so small. From down here she looked like a doll in a shoebox. He felt a wave of such intense visceral failure that it made him physically ill. He was her father. He was supposed to be the provider, the protector, the rock. But the rock was eroding. The rock was turning to sand. He gripped the steering wheel so hard the plastic groaned. Just a little longer, he whispered to the empty car. Just until she's older. Just until things level out. But as he climbed the stairs to the apartment, his hand trailing heavily on the banister, he didn't feel like a man going home. He felt like a soldier returning to a trench, bracing for the next shell to fall. He didn't know that the next shell wouldn't be a bill or a layoff. It would be a piece of paper, colored in the shades of his own hidden soul. The transition from the grease-slicked floor of the garage to the polished linoleum of Lincoln Elementary felt like stepping between two different planets. Elias moved through the hallways with a stiff, unnatural gait, his work boots squeaking rhythmically against the floor. He felt monstrously out of place. Around him, the walls were plastered with vibrant displays of construction paper, glittering suns, handprint turkeys, and jaggedly written poems about kindness. He caught his reflection in the glass of a trophy case and instinctively tried to rub a smudge of carbon from his cheek, only to smear it further. His fingernails were permanently rimmed with black, a stark contrast to the clean pastel world of Maya's school. He felt like a walking bruise in a room full of bandages. Mr. Vance, room 204 is just down the hall on the left, a passing aide said, her smile polite but flickering with a hint of pity. Elias nodded, his throat tight. He hated that look. He had spent 2 years dodging pity like a boxer dodges hooks. Pity didn't pay the light bill. Pity didn't put shoes on Maya's feet that didn't have holes in the soles. When he reached room 204, Mrs. Gable was waiting. She was a woman who seemed to be made of soft edges and warm tea, but today her expression was sharpened by a gravity that made Elias's stomach do a slow, sick roll. Elias, thank you for coming on such short notice, she said, gesturing to a chair that felt like it was designed for a different species. He sat, his knees nearly hitting his chin. Is Maya okay? Did she get into a fight? Is she sick? The word sick always came out of his mouth with a tremor. It was the word that had taken Sarah. No, nothing like that, Mrs. Gable said quickly, sensing his panic. Maya is a dream. She's helpful, she's bright, and she's remarkably protective of the other children. But, she paused, reaching into a manila folder on her desk. We did an assessment today. It's a standard psychological check-in through art. We asked the children to draw your hero. It's meant to show us who they look up to and, more importantly, how they perceive their support system. Elias felt a ghost of a smile. She probably drew her mom or maybe a firefighter. She's been obsessed with the trucks lately. She drew you, Elias. A surge of warmth, rare and intoxicating, flooded his chest. For a fleeting second the find felt real. He was a hero. Despite the debt, the cold apartment, and the exhaustion that felt like it was dissolving his bones, he was still the sun in his daughter's universe. She has a high opinion of me. Then, Elias said, his voice husky, I try my best. I know you do. Mrs. Gable said softly. But children are like mirrors, Elias. They don't just see what we show them. They reflect what we try to hide. Maya didn't draw the man you pretend to be. She drew the man she sees when you think she's asleep. She slid the drawing across the desk. Elias didn't pick it up at first. He just stared. It wasn't the heroic portrait he had envisioned. There were no capes, no muscles, no soaring through the clouds. The drawing was rendered almost entirely in dark, heavy charcoal and a violent, jarring shade of crimson. In the center of the page was a man. It was unmistakably him. She had even captured the specific way his blue work cap sat low over his brow. But the man wasn't standing on the ground. He was submerged up to his waist in a swamp of black ink. On his shoulders sat a literal mountain, a jagged gray mass that took up 2/3 of the paper. The man's arms were raised, his muscles depicted as thin, fraying ropes, straining to hold the peak of the mountain from crushing a tiny, colorful figure huddled in the corner. That figure was Maya. She was the only part of the drawing with color, a small splash of yellow dress and pink ribbons, but it was the man's chest that made Elias's breath stop. Maya had drawn a large, rectangular opening in the man's torso, like a window into an engine. Inside where the heart should be, she hadn't drawn a muscle or a valve. She had drawn a massive cracked stone, dripping with the red crayon. Underneath the image, in the shaky, earnest print of a 7-year-old, were the words that broke the fortress. My dad is a giant. He carries the mountain so it doesn't fall on me, but I think his bones are breaking. I hear them at night when he cries in the kitchen. He says he is fine, but the stone in his chest is getting too heavy. I want to help him carry it, but I'm too small. The silence in the classroom was no longer just a silence, it was a vacuum. Elias felt the air being sucked out of his lungs. The find didn't just crumble, it evaporated, leaving him naked and exposed under the bright school lights. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he hadn't been protecting Maya from his pain. He had been forcing her to witness it from the shadows. By refusing to share the weight, he had made her a helpless spectator to his slow destruction. He had thought he was a shield, but to Maya he was a tragedy in progress. Elias, Mrs. Gable reached out, her hand hovering near his arm. She told me today that she tries to stay awake at night to make sure you're still breathing. She's carrying the weight of your survival on her shoulders because she knows you won't let her help. Elias looked at his hands, those grease-stained, trembling hands. He saw them now as Maya saw them, as tools that were failing, as parts of a machine that was grinding itself into dust, I thought. Elias started, his voice cracking like dry wood. I thought if I just kept my head down, if I didn't complain, if I just worked, I thought she wouldn't have to know. She loves you, Mrs. Gable said, and because she loves you, she knows you're trying to be a god for her, Elias, but she just needs a father. A father who is human enough to hurt, so she can be human enough to help. Elias stood up, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. He picked up the drawing, the paper feeling as heavy as the mountain depicted on it. He didn't look at Mrs. Gable. He couldn't. I have to go, he whispered. Elias, wait, there are resources. The school has. I have to go see her, he interrupted, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. He didn't run, but he moved with a frantic purpose, bursting through the school's double doors into the chilly afternoon air. The world looked different now. The gray sky wasn't just weather. It was the color of his own fatigue. The cars rushing by weren't just traffic. They were symbols of the time he was losing, the hours he was selling away for a find that didn't exist. He walked toward their apartment, the drawing clutched in his hand. He thought about every time he'd turned away from her so she would see him wince. Every time he'd eaten a piece of toast while she had the only egg. Every time he'd said fine when his soul was screaming for a moment's rest. He had been building a wall to keep her safe, but he had accidentally built a cage. As he turned the corner to their street, he saw the apartment building, a sagging brick structure that looked like it was tired of standing up. He saw their window, and for the first time in 2 years he didn't see a fortress he had to defend. He saw a home that was starving for the truth. He climbed the stairs, the sound of his boots echoing like a countdown. He reached the door, took a shuddering breath, and turned the key. The smell of burnt toast met him, a small domestic disaster that usually would have prompted him to leap into fix-it mode. But today, he just stood there. Maya was on the stool, her back to him, her small frame silhouetted against the dim light of the kitchen. She was scraping a charred piece of bread with a butter knife, her movements repetitive and anxious. I'm making dinner, Daddy, she said without turning around, her voice small and trembling. You're late. So I thought. I thought maybe the mountain got too big today. Elias dropped his keys. They hit the floor with a metallic ring that signaled the end of the silence. Maya, he said. She turned her eyes wide, searching his face for the mask. She looked for the fine grin, the tired but steady eyes, the fake strength, but she didn't find them. Elias let the drawing flutter to the floor. He sank to his knees right there in the doorway, his head bowing, his shoulders finally dropping the weight of the world. It's too heavy, Bug, he choked out, the first real words he'd spoken in years. The stone. It's too heavy. The butter knife hit the counter with a clatter. Maya didn't hesitate. She scrambled off the stool and ran, throwing her small, warm body against him with the force of a tidal wave. And as Elias finally let the tears fall thick, hot and honest, he realized that the mountain wasn't falling on her. It was finally, mercifully, beginning to melt. The linoleum was cold, smelling of pine-scented floor cleaner and the sharp, acrid temps of Maya's burnt toast. But Elias didn't move. He remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against his daughter's small shoulder. The sound he was making, a low, ragged keening, was the sound of a structural failure. It was the sound of a dam bursting after a decade of holding back the flood. Maya didn't pull away. She didn't act like a child who was scared of her father's breakdown. Instead, she stood there like a tiny, unshakable anchor, her small hands patting his hair, her fingers catching on the tangles and the bits of metal shavings that always seemed to linger there. "I got you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice a steady contrast to his shuddering breaths. "I got you." For 2 years, Elias had operated under the delusion that his grief was a private property, a fenced-off wasteland where only he was allowed to wander. He had thought that by keeping his face a blank slate of fine, he was preserving Maya's childhood. He hadn't realized that children are the world's most intuitive detectives. They don't need a map to find the pain. They can feel the temperature of the room drop whenever the fine becomes a lie. Finally, the sobbing ebbed into a hollow, exhausted silence. Elias pulled back, his face puffy and streaked with the grime of the garage mixed with salt. He looked at Maya. She looked back, her expression one of profound relief, as if she had been waiting for him to join her in the real world for a very long time. "I saw the drawing, Maya," he said, his voice a ghost of itself. She glanced at the paper on the floor of the charcoal man with the stone heart. "Mrs. Gable said it was a good drawing, but it's not finished." "It felt finished to me," Elias whispered. "No," Maya said firmly. She walked over, picked up the drawing, and brought it to the kitchen table. She pointed to the black swamp he was sinking into. "This is why you're always tired. You think you're sinking alone. But look," she pointed to the tiny, colorful version of herself in the corner. "In the next one, I'm going to draw a rope, and maybe a ladder, and maybe some other people." Elias stood up, his joints protesting with every inch of movement. He felt lighter, but also strangely fragile, like a bone that had been reset but hadn't yet begun to knit back together. He looked around the kitchen. It was a ruin in washed dishes, the stack of bills, the flickering bulb. This was his reality. And for the first time, he didn't try to look past it. He looked at it. "I'm sorry, Bug," he said, sitting heavily in the chair. "I'm so sorry I made you feel like you had to watch me break. I thought I was protecting you." "You were," Maya said, climbing into the chair opposite him. She reached out and took his hand. Her palm was soft. His was like 40 grit sandpaper. "But protecting is boring. I'd rather we just be a team." The night didn't end with a magical solution, but it ended with a different kind of fine. They ate the burnt toast together, scraping the black bits into the trash and actually laughing at the bitter taste. For the first time in 700 days, Elias did look at the clock and calculate how many minutes of sleep he could steal before the warehouse shift. "I'm not going in tonight," he said. Maya's eyes widened. "To the big cold house?" "No, not tonight. Not ever again. Maybe." He knew the math didn't work. He knew that by staying home, he was inviting the past due notices to turn into eviction notices. But he also knew that if he went back into that freezer tonight, the stone in his chest would finally finish what it started. He was choosing survival over stability, a gamble he had never dared to take before. The next morning, the world didn't end. The sun rose over the city, casting a pale, indifferent light through the grime of their windows. Elias woke up at 7 a.m. not because an alarm went off, but because the sun was hitting his face. For a moment, he felt the familiar surge of panic. "Though I'm late, I'm losing money, I'm failing reflex." Then, he felt a small weight on his feet. Maya was sitting at the end of his bed, reading a book. She wasn't waiting for him to wake up so she could be fed. She was just waiting for him. "Good morning, Daddy," she said. "Morning, Bug." He went to the garage that day, but something had shifted. The air didn't feel as heavy. When Miller, the boss, barked at him about a slow oil change on a Chevy, Elias didn't shrink. He didn't offer a hollow fine. "I'm going as fast as the tools allow, Miller," Elias said, standing up straight. "And I'm taking my lunch break today. A full 30 minutes. Miller paused, a cigarette dangling from his lip. He looked at Elias, really looked at him. He saw the man who had been a ghost for 2 years suddenly possessing a shadow again. "Take 40, Miller grunted. "You look like you need to sit in the sun for a minute." During those 40 minutes, Elias didn't stare into space. He went to the local library, 3 blocks away. He sat at a computer that smelled of old dust and looked up the foreman position Mrs. Gable had mentioned. It was with a construction firm called Vanguard Structural. They were looking for someone with mechanical expertise who understood how to manage a crew. The salary was nearly double what he made at the garage. It came with insurance, it came with a 401k, it came with a life. He looked at the requirements section. 5+ years mechanical experience, check. Leadership capabilities, check. Ability to work under high pressure. Elias almost laughed at this. One, he had been living under a mountain. What was a little construction pressure? But there was a catch. The application required a digital portfolio of past work or a detailed technical resume. Elias hadn't touched a resume since he was 19. His portfolio was the hundreds of engines he had brought back to life in the dark, greasy corners of Miller's garage. He felt the familiar cold fingers of the fine creeping back in. "You're just a grease monkey, Elias. You don't belong in a foreman's office. You don't have the words." He was about to close the browser when he reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled corner of Maya's drawing. He pulled it out and smoothed it over the library desk. He looked at the man holding up the mountain. "I think his bones are breaking." Elias looked at his hands. They were stained. Yes, they were scarred. But they were the hands of a man who could build things. They were the hands of a man who could keep a child safe. If he could hold up a mountain of grief and debt for 2 years without collapsing, he could certainly manage a crew of carpenters and electricians. He didn't just fill out the application. He wrote a cover letter. He didn't use the standard, dry corporate language. He wrote the truth. "My name is Elias Vance. For the last 10 years, I've fixed things that people thought were unfixable. I've worked in the heat and the cold, often at the same time. I don't just know how machines work. I know how people work when they're tired, when they're frustrated, and when they need a leader who won't quit on them. I've spent the last 2 years carrying a weight I thought would break me. It didn't. I'm still standing. I want to build things that last, because I have someone at home who is counting on me to show her that the world is just made of black ink and gray stones." He hit submit with a hand that didn't tremble. The week that followed was a blur of tension. The landlord called twice. The grocery bill was a puzzle he solved by buying a 20-pound bag of rice and a prayer. Every time the phone rang, Elias's heart did a frantic dance against his ribs. On Thursday, the phone rang, but it wasn't the landlord. "Mr. Vance, this is Sarah Jenkins from Vanguard Structural. We received your rather unconventional application." Elias gripped the phone. "I apologize if it was too much. I just know," she interrupted. Her voice sounded surprised, perhaps even a little impressed. "Our CEO read it. He said he is tired of hiring foremen who speak in bullet points but don't know how to hold a wrench. He wants to see you tomorrow, 8 a.m., wear something that isn't covered in oil." Elias hung up and sat on the floor of the hallway. He didn't cry this time. He just breathed. Maya came out of her room holding a new drawing. "Daddy, is the mountain getting smaller?" Elias pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair. "The mountain isn't getting smaller, but I think we're finally starting to climb it." The interview was a gauntlet of a different kind. He sat in a glass-walled office that looked out over the city. Across from him sat a man named Marcus, whose hands looked remarkably like Elias's cleaner, but with the same thick, powerful grip of someone who had spent years in the field. Marcus didn't ask about his resume. He pointed to the copy of the cover letter on his desk. "You wrote this," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. You talked about holding up a weight you thought would break you. You want to tell me what that weight was?" Elias looked at the man. He could have lied. He could have talked about market pressures or industrial challenges. But he looked at the drawing Maya had made, the one he had tucked into his pocket for luck. "My wife died," Elias said, the words sharp and clear. "I had a mountain of debt, a 7-year-old daughter who was watching me crumble, and a job that treated me like a part of the floor. I was trying to be a hero by being a ghost. I was trying to be fine until I realized that fine was killing us both." Marcus leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "And why should I hire a man who admits he was at his breaking point?" "Because," Elias said, leaning forward, "a man who has been to the breaking point and didn't break is the only man you want leading a crew when things go wrong on a job site. I know how to endure, I know how to adapt, and I know exactly what's at stake if I fail." Marcus was silent for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked a steady rhythmic sound that no longer felt like a countdown. "We start the East Side project on Monday," Marcus said, standing up and extending his hand. "It's a rough site, high stakes, a lot of moving parts. I need a foreman who can keep his head when the rain starts falling." "You think you can do that, Vance?" Elias shook his hand. The grip was firm. The fine was gone, replaced by something much harder, much more real. "I've been standing in the rain for 2 years, sir. I'm ready for the sun." Elias walked out of the building and into the afternoon light. He didn't go to the garage. He went to the park. He sat on a bench and watched the kids playing on the swings. He looked at his hands. They were still stained, but they felt different. They felt like they belonged to a man who was finally, truly, in control of his own life. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Gable. "He got the job, didn't he?" she asked before he could even speak. "He did," Elias said, a smile finally reaching his eyes. "And Mrs. Gable, thank you for showing me what I was trying so hard not to see." "Don't thank me, Elias. Thank the artist." When Elias got home, he didn't find Maya scraping toast. He found her sitting at the table, A box of brand new 64-pack crayons spread out before her, a gift Elias had splurged on with the last of his emergency cash on the way home. She was working on a new drawing. In this one, there was no black swamp, there was no gray mountain, there was a house, a simple, sturdy house with a red roof and a garden. Outside the house were two figures. They were both colored in the brightest yellows, oranges and blues. They were holding hands. And in the middle of the man's chest, where the cracked stone had been, Maya had drawn something else. It was a heart. It wasn't perfect. It was a little lopsided, and the red color bled outside the lines, but it was big. It was vibrant, and it was beating. Underneath, she had written a new caption. My dad isn't a giant anymore. He's just my dad, and that's even better. Elias sat down next to her, took a bright green crayon, and started to draw the grass. They didn't talk about the debt, or the move, or the long road ahead. They didn't have to. The silence in the apartment was gone, replaced by the soft, rhythmic sound of crayons on paper, the sound of two people building a life, one color at a time. For the first time in his life, Elias Vance didn't have to say he was fine. He just was. The silence of the apartment had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating shroud of things unsaid. It was the quiet of a workshop, the peaceful hum of a foundation being reinforced. 6 months had passed since Elias had walked out of Miller's garage for the last time, and the transformation of their lives was written in the very air they breathed. They had moved, not to a palace but to a small 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of the city, where the air didn't taste of exhaust and the walls didn't weep with dampness. Here, the radiators hummed with a confident warmth, and the windows looked out over a patch of dirt that Elias was teaching Maya to turn into a garden. Elias stood in the kitchen, packing Maya's lunch. He wasn't rushing. He was unchecking his watch every 30 seconds with the frantic eyes of a man hunted by his own schedule. He moved with a deliberate, steady rhythm. He looked down at his hands. The deep-set grease was finally gone, replaced by the clean, dry calluses of a man who managed blueprints and oversaw the pouring of concrete. His fingernails were clean. His back, while still prone to a dull ache at the end of a long day on the site, no longer felt like it was made of splintering wood. Dad, have you seen my blue folder? Maya's voice drifted from the hallway, clear and bright, devoid of the cautious whisper she used to carry like a shield. Check the bench by the door, Bug. I saw it hiding under your hat, Elias called back. He heard the scuffle of sneakers, a triumphant found it, and then Maya appeared in the doorway. She was taller, or perhaps she just stood straighter. The oversized, drab cardigans had been replaced by a bright teal windbreaker, and her hair was tied back in a neat, confident braid. As he handed her the brown paper bag, he noticed she was holding a heavy, leather-bound sketchbook. It was a far cry from the cheap spiral-bound pads he used to scramble to buy her new project, he asked, nodding toward the book. The biggest one yet, she said with a mysterious grin. Mrs. Gable said I could present it at the end of your assembly. It's a series. A series, huh? Big time. Can I get a sneak peek? Maya hugged the book to her chest, her eyes dancing. Not yet. It's a surprise for the new blueprint ceremony. The new blueprint ceremony was what Maya had titled their move-in anniversary. It was a tradition they had started to mark the day they left the fine behind. That evening, after a dinner that involved fresh vegetables and actual steak, not the thin gray strips of mystery meat from their old life, Elias sat on the porch. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burning gold. It was a cinematic sky, the kind that made everything feel significant. Maya came out and sat beside him, the leather sketchbook in her lap. She looked out at the horizon, her small face solemn. Dad, she said softly, do you remember the day in Mrs. Gable's office when you saw the stone heart? Elias felt a faint ghost of that old weight, but it didn't crush him. It was just a memory now, a landmark in the rearview mirror. I remember, Maya, every day I was really scared that day, she confessed, looking down at her hands. I thought if I drew it, the stone would become real and stay there forever. But when you cried, when we were on the floor together, the stone didn't get bigger. It started to break. She opened the sketchbook. I wanted to show you the rest of the story, she whispered. She turned to the first page. It was a recreation of the original drawing, the gray man, the mountain, the red lines of pain. But this time, she had used professional pencils, the shading deep and nuanced. This was the beginning, she said. She flipped the page. The second drawing showed the man standing in front of a giant, glass building. He was still gray, but his posture had changed. He wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking at the sun. Beside him, the tiny, colorful girl was holding a flashlight, shining it on a path made of words. This was the bridge, Maya explained. When you told the truth to that man Marcus, you used your words to build a bridge over the swamp. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He watched as she flipped through page after page, documenting their journey with the brutal honesty only a child possesses. She had drawn the move, the new house, and even a scene of Elias sleeping on the new sofa, his face peaceful. Finally, she reached the last page. It was a panoramic drawing of a construction site. In the center stood a man who looked exactly like Elias. He was wearing his foreman's vest, a hard hat, and a tool belt. He was surrounded by other people, men and women with hammers and blueprints, all looking to him. But he wasn't carrying a mountain anymore. Instead, the man was part of a giant, human chain. Everyone was holding a piece of a beautiful, rising structure, a library or a school. The mountain from the first drawing had been broken down into individual stones, and those stones were being used to build the foundation of the new building. The man's chest was no longer a window with a stone. It was solid, colored in a warm, steady brown. But on his shoulder, there was a small, golden bird. "What's the bird?" "Bug," Elias asked, his voice thick. "That's the fine," Maya said, looking up at him. "But the real kind, the kind that has wings. You don't have to carry it anymore, Dad. It just stays with you because it wants to." Elias took the sketchbook, his fingers tracing the lines of the drawing. He thought about the millions of fathers out there, the ones still sitting in the dark, staring at Ramenstein, convinced that their silence was a gift to their children. He wished he could show them this book. He wished he could tell them that children don't want a hero who never bleeds. They want a father who lets them help band-aid the wound. "You saved me, Maya," Elias said, pulling her into the crook of his arm. "That drawing in the classroom, it was the loudest thing I've ever heard. It woke me up. We saved each other," she corrected him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "That's what teams do." The story of the single dad who hid his pain didn't end with a happily ever after in the fairy tale sense. There were still bills to manage, though they were no longer terrifying. There were still long days and stressful deadlines. There were still moments when the shadow of Sarah's loss would drift through the house like a cold draft. But the fine was gone. In its place was a messy, honest, beautiful reality. A few weeks later, Elias was at the job site. A young apprentice, a kid no older than 20, was sitting on a crate during his break, head in his hands, looking the way Elias used to look every single morning. Elias walked over and sat down beside him. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell him to tough it out. "It's a lot, isn't it?" Elias asked. The kid looked up, startled. "I'm fine, Mr. Vance. Just a headache." Elias looked at the kid's trembling hands, the way he was avoiding eye contact. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small laminated copy of Maya's latest drawing, the one with the human chain. "Being fine is the heaviest thing you'll ever carry, son," Elias said gently. "If the mountain's getting too big, you need to say so, because you can't build anything stable on a foundation of secrets." The apprentice looked at the drawing, then back at Elias. He saw the scars on Ilias's hands, but he also saw the peace in his eyes. Slowly, the kid's shoulders dropped. "I don't know if I can do this," the boy whispered. "My mom's sick, and I'm the only one working." And Elias listened. He didn't interrupt. He just sat there, a man who had been a ghost, now acting as a lighthouse. As he walked back to his station later that afternoon, Elias looked up at the skeletal frame of the building they were raising. It was strong. It was honest. It was being built stone by stone, by people who knew exactly how much each stone weighed. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Maya. "Coming home early. Let's work on the garden. I'm ready to plant the sunflowers." The reply came almost instantly. "Okay, Daddy, I'll get the shovels. I already drew what they're going to look like. They're going to be taller than us." Elias smiled. He tucked the phone away and picked up his blueprint. The world was still a challenging place, and the mountains were still there, but he wasn't afraid of the heights anymore. He had a team, he had the truth, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was going. The cinematic sun set over the construction site, casting long, bold shadows of the structures yet to be built, and in the center of it all stood a man who had stopped hiding, and in doing so, had finally found his way home.